Hello, kind people. This is Peter Svidler for Chess24 doing a recap video of round 7 of the Tata Steel Wijk tournament in 2019. And there will be two recap videos this round. Jan has covered, I believe, the game between Vladimir Kramnik and Viswanathan Anand. A very interesting game as well. And I will be doing a video on the game between Teimour Radjabov and Vidit. So let's jump straight into the action. Prior to that game, Vidit was on +1, having beaten Jordan van Foreest and drawn all his remaining games, and Teimour made 6 draws. So both of them had a very solid tournament, but a somewhat unspectacular tournament. This was about to change. Radjabov opens with d4, knight f6, c4, e6, knight f3, d5, knight c3, and Vidit plays bishop b4 here. The Rogozin has been doing exceptionally well recently. Black seems to be pretty much untroubled in the main lines after cd5, e5, bishop g5, which is why Teimour starts with queen a4 check, knight c6, and e3. Not an unknown line by any means, it's quite a solid line these days against the Rogozin, but still it's a departure from what was for many decades, I would say, the absolute main line against the variation. Black castles, queen c2. It's also possible to play bishop d2. I myself played this against Giri, but black takes, goes bishop d6, and is supposed to be completely fine. After queen c2, black plays rook e8, white plays bishop d2 now. And here we enter this little phase of the game where there is a lot of fight going on sort of behind the scenes for the one tempo connected with the d takes c4, bishop takes c4 sequence. Black would very often want to take on c4 and follow it up by e6, e5, as you can see with the arrows on the screen. And white would obviously prefer to take on c4 in one tempo from the f1 square, not from e2, not from d3, but from f1. And therefore, in the next couple of moves, both sides will be making all the useful moves they can, whilst black will not be taking on c4 and white will not be developing this bishop. Vidit plays bishop d6. A move somewhat rare, although one move later we will be back to known territory. Normally black starts with a6 here, in order, I think, specifically to avoid after bishop d6 the option of c5, bishop f8, bishop b5, which I clicked around for a bit here, and I have a feeling this is actually a very serious idea. I'm not saying white immediately gets a huge advantage, but it's very playable and very much worth considering. But Teimour plays h3, which is very standard in these positions. First of all, as I mentioned, trying to save time and not develop the bishop yet. And secondly, there are obviously other ideas behind the move h3, which you will see later in the game. a6, a3, bishop d7. It's also possible to play h6. Levon Aronian played this against Nakamura a couple of years ago, but bishop d7 is the main move in this position. Played among others by Anish Giri, by Magnus Carlsen in the game against Sergei Karyakin. So definitely a very major theoretical decision here, not rare at all. And in this position, Karyakin tried taking on d5 and playing bishop d3, and Magnus replied to this by playing knight a7. A weird looking move, but still a very interesting idea. Black wants to play c6, and then the knight might come out, let's say, via the b5 square. Karyakin picked up the gauntlet and played queen b3, queen b7, knight b5, knight takes b5. And here Magnus recaptured by taking with the a pawn, and then the game ended in a draw when black just chased the queen on b7 around after knight e5. Analysis shows that taking with the c pawn and then after castles playing bishop c7, with a very simple plan of playing bishop b6 and rook a7, would have actually given Magnus a very large advantage, and that was a bit of a miss on the part of the world champion, but not that critical to the theory of the opening. I just wanted to give you a bit of a historical overview. Bishop e2, the move that Radjabov played here, is also very normal. You could make some argument for including one more waiting move and playing rook d1, but black already can start pushing with e6, e5 here. So bishop e2 is the main move. D takes c4, bishop takes c4, h6. And this is a very important theoretical position. For instance, in Norway Chess 2017, there was an absolutely mad game played between Levon Aronian and Anish Giri, which continued castles, e5, rook a1, queen e7, knight h4, queen d8, queen b3, rook f8, and the evaluation changed very, very dramatically throughout the game, and the game was eventually drawn. And in this position, after some thought, not instantly, but reasonably quickly, Teimour essays the move g2, g4, which is obviously the other reason for playing h3, which I alluded to earlier. And this White sets up his tent and says, I will be giving mate in this game. I am no longer concerned about king safety, stability in the center, none of these things interest me. I am planning to play g5 and then attack along the g file, and the king, if anywhere, it will go to the queen side. And we are very thankful to Teimour for doing this, because it gave us a very, very interesting game. But objectively, I think the idea will not find very many followers, because Black is doing quite well here objectively. And the reply by Vidit doesn't really leave him in too bad a situation, but it does betray, I think, some slight naivete, or perhaps just a simple miscalculation, or a combination of both, because he plays e5 in reply, which is sort of what you're supposed to do when your opponent starts play on one of the flanks. You're supposed to immediately counter-strike in the center. But it also gives White this tremendously strong bishop on the a2-ga diagonal, which is something White badly wants, considering that his attacking plan is g5, very often connected with the knight landing on g5 and attacking the pawn on f7. And instead of that, it was much better to play b5, also a very, very normal move. Bishop a2 now is just very simply bad after b4. And obviously you do not want to be taking and giving up this bishop on a2, so you play something like knight e2. Black takes on a3 and does, well, something sensible. For instance, the machine really likes to move rook b8 here. And very notably, when the pawn stays on e6 in positions like this, it's very, very difficult for White to start anything serious on the king side. After g5, hg, knight takes g5, Black very simply picks up the pawn on a3 here. And somewhere around here, the machine starts thinking White is more or less completely busted. G5 is a mistake. You can play more conservatively, and you don't necessarily have to lose this game, but you will be fighting for equality here with White. The critical move is bishop d3, and if Black plays e5 here, you can play d5, and after something like knight a5, you can play, for instance, g5, hg, and knight takes g5. And this is some kind of a mess. Once again, I'm not prepared to say White is better. It's a very unclear position, but at least White gets something along the lines of what he wants. But after bishop d3, there's a very, very strong quiet move, queen e7. First of all, Black creates an idea of playing e5 and replying to g5 with simply e4, forking the light squares, the light pieces on f3 and d3. And secondly, Black is just in no hurry to commit to any one development in the center or on the queen side. b5, b4 remains very much in his thoughts. And I tried making some normal moves here. For instance, if you play g5, takes, knight g5, Black replies to this by playing e5, d5, e4. A very typical maneuver, because Black values the idea of playing knight e5 much more than a pawn. White takes, Black goes knight e5. In this position, I think it is reasonable for a human player to understand why the machine already prefers Black, although not to the extent that it thinks White is in a lot of trouble. But Black already is favored by the machine in this position, because the king is unsafe. With the knight on e5 attacking the bishop on d3, it's very difficult to imagine White ever having any kind of a serious push on the king side, and the pawn is not really very keenly felt. So g5 is not particularly great. Instead of that, White can try something like rook g1, but the machine replies to this in two very acceptable fashions. You can go b4 and simply take on a3 next move, and once again the attack seems to be nowhere near fast enough. Or you can play, as I mentioned, e5, d5, and here knight d4, which is another topic you will see time and time again in these positions, is not that strong here, because after ed, ED92 doesn't seem to be working. Black plays E4 instead, and white just castles, takes, and queen takes. And here, black definitely has some play after b5, b4, but he is trying to equalize. He is not really better. And the other option here after e5, d5 would be to play e4, where the machine plays knight takes, dc6, takes here actually with the king. Black goes bishop e6. But the king will have a reasonably safe square on e2 here. So the computer prefers white here, although once again not to such a degree that I would say this is unplayable for white. Black definitely has a very, very nice compensation in this position. And eventually the choice here, I believe, is between the move rook d1, which once again is not that easy to figure out why white is making this move, because it means that you will never castle queenside. But the important part for the computer is that after e4, knight e4, and e6, e5, which is often what the computer does in this position, or let's say ba, and e6, e5 here. White can take on e5, and the rook on a1 will never actually hang after all the trades on the e5 square. And white actually ends up reasonably happy in some position like this, and bishop b4. And yes, the king looks slightly weird on e1, but white can eventually castle kingside. And as mentioned, it's very, very relevant that nothing is hanging on a1 here. But after rook d1, white has to give up the dream of giving mate on the kingside. And if you still want the dream to be alive, you probably have to play knight e4 here. Black replies e5. It's the only move that makes any sense, but it's very strong. And here, if you take on e5 and give black what he wants, open files in the center, black will be doing quite well. But you can play d5. And here, there is an option of knight d4, but there's also an option, of course, to take the pawn on d5, which looks very normal. And now white either plays g5 immediately or rook g1 first, and continues in this very quiet manner, just to build up some pressure in the center, and aims to open the g file. I think black is doing quite well here, and probably also doing quite well after knight d4. But this way, at least, the dream is sort of still alive to give mate. But generally what I wanted to, like this first very long excursion into the positions, which did not happen in the game, was to illustrate that e6, e5, whilst not a bad move, is really playing into white's hands here, and playing in a more conservative manner for a couple of moves yet was a much better choice, practically at least. e5, of course, is met immediately by g4, g5. Nobody is going to react to e5 by playing d5, closing down your own wonderful bishop on c4, or doing anything else equally silly. And after g5, already black needs to play very, very precisely, although I believe that he has... I really hesitate to call it equality, but he has a decent game after both captures on d4. The first one to look at, of course, is ed4, and this, I think, is what Vidit was expecting to play more or less instantly when he played e5. Of course, he did not blunder g5 in this position. But after g5, he obviously, because Radjabov was playing so confidently and continuing down what seems to be a losing path, he stopped and started asking himself which moves I may have missed here that Radjabov can make. Because obviously, if you take the knight, queen takes f6, white is just more or less completely busted because both of his knights are hanging and there is no attack. And he came to the conclusion, I don't know which move he scared him more, but there are two moves here which lead to basically the same position, more or less. Those moves are gh or the more quiet rook g1. And both of them are very, very strong. But black has basically the same reply to both. You need to stop disaster striking on the a2 g8 diagonal. I can't draw the a2 g8 diagonal, but I will eventually be able to. You have to play bishop e6. More or less nothing else suffices here, and the same applies to gh6. If you take on c3, bishop takes c3, your position is already incredibly critical. There's also, I will mention it here, a very, very a strong threat, as always, in these types of positions of queen c2, g6. Once again, bringing back our attention to the fact that there is no pawn on e6 and the pawn on f7 will be pinned, and black will never be able to take on g6. And after dc3, bishop takes e3, the best move black has is queen f4, specifically aimed at trying to remove this pawn on h6. But white can still play queen g6, bishop takes h6, and simply castle long here. And in this position, the attack is so strong that the best outcome black can hope for is a really, really horrible endgame after queen e7, bishop takes f6, takes, and rook takes d7. I think you can assess this position as probably being just technically winning for white. Although, black of course is not obliged to resign just yet. So let's return to the best play for black here, because otherwise we will be here for all night. Black has to play bishop e6, bishop takes, rook g1, knight h5, and the same position we would have arrived at if white starts with rook g1. Once again, dc3, bishop c3 is more or less lost for black, but black can play bishop e6 here, white takes, black takes, gh5, g6, sorry, knight h5, and we arrive at the same position. The best move for white here is knight e2. And now black should just take on h6 and don't really go for anything fancy. White takes on d4, black takes. Here, for some reason, the machine insists that it's useful to drive the rook to some square that is not g1. I'm not entirely sure why, but the machine is very insistent on that point. And after something like rook g2, bishop e5, knight f3, queen f6, takes, castles long, and rook d8. Optically, this position should be favorable for white, but the machine holds it. The machine says, yes, it's slightly better for white, but I think draw is the most likely result out of these complications. So after g5, the move e4, which I'm pretty sure Vidit was just planning to make immediately on the board before going into a very, very deep tank, would have actually, I think, been quite okay to play with precise play. But there's also the option which you have to mention here, which is knight takes d4. And this is a very recurrent theme. Black always has this source of counterplay. And this leads to unbelievably messy positions. In particular, I want to show you a position after e4, because knight takes d4 you can understand, it's a lot easier to understand intuitively that black has very, very good compensation after takes, gf, queen takes f6, let's say knight e2. Knight d5 looks very attractive instead, but after queen f3, it's very much worth noting that white will never be able to castle queenside, because the square on d1 is controlled by the queen on f3, so you have to make really ugly moves like rook g1, and black can even continue chasing it by playing bishop h2. And here the computer says black is close to winning. So you play knight e2, black plays b5, and as mentioned, I think it's not impossible for a human player to understand why this is quite attractive for black, because the king is somewhat stuck in the center. The light pieces are not doing great. For instance, after bishop d3, black has a very strong reply c5, intending c4 and d3. And after bishop d5, there's a number of things black can try. Rook a d8 is playable, even rook a c8, intending in some positions just playing c6, in some positions playing c5. Also gives black very decent play for the sacrificed material. So it's a mess, but it's a mess where you can sort of figure out on your own that black should not be doing so horribly. But after e takes d4 discover check, and knight e2. Here playing this position precisely is very, very difficult, and understanding what's happening here is also very difficult. The best move in this position is b5. This already is quite tricky, I think, because your knight on f6 is hanging, but this you can sort of understand. And now the position after queen e2, bishop e2, queen e7, we'll return to this in a moment. But the position in particular I wanted to show you arises after bishop d3. Black is a piece down here, and the only move he can make here, which will give him a decent game, is just c7, c5. Just leaving the knight on f6 as if it wasn't hanging at all. And yeah, playing like this is extremely difficult unless you know exactly what you're doing because you've prepared this position. I tried asking the machine for some kind of a lengthy evaluation, and I think it came up with some slight advantage for white after gf6, queen f6, and rook g1, immediately returning one of the pieces. The position is horribly messy, but it seems like white can play like this. Or there's a really weird, really long forced draw after gh6, bishop c6, rook g1, bishop takes f3, and bishop h7 check here. Once again, I do not invite the viewers to even try to understand why the computer thinks this is best play. I didn't, and I wouldn't recommend it to anyone. But this is what the machine spat out at me after thinking for a significant amount of time. And this is some kind of a forced draw. After knight h7, rook g7, king f8, queen h7, rook e2, king f1, and for some reason the only move to make here is rook f2, queen h4, and this is a perpetual. Let's move on. I think we should be using this phrase quite a bit in this analysis because the positions are so messy that at some point you should just sort of cut the cord and move to the next one. After a very significant amount of time spent in a tank, Vidit played b5 here, which is a very playable idea, and well, sort of kudos to him for realizing this is even an option because the position looks so messy. But I think objectively his options become slightly less attractive after b5. Radjabov plays bishop a2 as expected, and here I think was the last moment for black to objectively get equality in the game, or at least close to equality. With this knight takes d4 move yet again, knight takes d4, e d4, gf6, queen takes f6 is very good for black. It's based on a very precise move in this position. Long castles, dc3, queen, bishop c3. Black would be in a lot of trouble if he did not have the move queen f5, but it's not so difficult to find. You offer a trade of queens, and after rook g1, you will have just enough resources and just enough time to secure your kingside and not lose the g7 pawn, and then you're better because you're a pawn up. So knight takes d4 is not great, but after e d4, e d4, knight e2, and queen e7, and queen e7 is absolutely the only move here, we once again land in this sort of never land where the computer evaluation appears to be around equal, but it's impossible to play, I think, for both white and black. It's one of those positions where you look at it, you look at the computer analysis, and you say to yourself, I would have lost this with either color. White is supposed to play knight takes d4 here, unsurprisingly. If white castles long, you take on e2. Gf d3 is just bad for white. So after queen e2, white takes on d4, black plays queen e4, and this is some kind of a weird equality because once again, an attempt to give direct mate by gf6, queen d4, rook g1, queen takes f6, and bishop c3 runs into a very strong move, rook e5, and once you've eliminated the main threat, which is the bishop on c3, you don't even care that you have to give up an exchange for it. Black is just much better. But white has all kinds of strange moves like g5, g6 here, which I think lead to playable positions with him. But black is very much untroubled after, let's say, king f8. So the best move after queen is knight takes d4, as I mentioned, to which, having lured the knight away from f3, black just replies by taking on g5. And the threat clearly is c7, c5, so you have to stop it. You play bishop e3. And here the machine, after some thought, just goes bishop d6, f4. And once again, I left it running here for a very long time. And what it says is just like I just want to show you a line I've seen on my screen at some point, which I think is very indicative of just how mad this entire thing is. Bishop takes f4, gf, rook g1, very understandable. Black just ignores it and goes c5. White goes queen g6, once again the same motif, creating a threat of mate in 1. Black says no mate for you today, interposing the knight. White goes long castles. And here, c takes d4, white would just reply with knight takes d4, and white is at least somewhat better, which is why, absolutely insanity, black just goes c5, c4, saying, okay, I have now blocked down your bishop on a2, and I'm threatening to take your queen. White goes queen h5, black takes on f2. The only move not to be worse is rook takes g7, black takes, white gives a check. Black, if he doesn't want to resign, goes knight g4, white takes hg, and black just very quietly goes queen e5 here, knight f5 check, he takes and goes king f8. And this, as you may have guessed, is if you know how these things work these days, is a draw. White can continue in a slow manner. There's some perpetuals available immediately, or you can play something like king b1 here, and black can take on e2, and apparently he doesn't get mated, or he can play rook a d8 and continue quietly, but the variation remains 0-0-0 in all of these positions. And I show you this because on the one hand, sort of the beauty of the correctly played chess is quite spectacular, but on the other hand, who are we kidding? It's impossible to find in a practical game. It's very possible to start calculating knight takes d4, but there's really no way you see very far in advance here, and already convincing yourself that after knight takes d4 you have enough time to just take on g5 would be quite difficult, and convincing yourself that after bishop e3 you have enough time to play bishop f4, that would be superhuman in my opinion. Instead of that, Vidit made the move e takes d4, which is very, very understandable. And here, white has a number of very attractive options, but the two most discussed, I mean, there's also the long castle, which I think is a whole separate mess all by itself, and I haven't really looked at it properly because Radjabov made a move which in the game basically won by force. And there was also a lot of mention during the live show. Gh6 is what Radjabov chose, and rook g1 was very much championed by people in chat as the machine suggestion. Both of these moves are quite strong, but rook g1 I think objectively is stronger. In many cases it will lead to the same positions, but it limits some of black's options. And here, more or less, the only move not to resign on the spot is knight e5. And I think the major difference between those two moves, if we take it sort of calmer and try to figure out why rook g1 could be stronger than gh6, the very simple explanation for it is that you retain the option of taking the knight, and the knight is a more important piece than the pawn. So it basically just keeps more options open for white. As mentioned, dc3, bishop c3, you can more or less resign here. It's a really, really horrible position. So the only way not to resign is to go knight e5. White takes, black takes with the bishop. And here there's once again some absolutely insane equalities after, for instance, gh6, dc3, rook g7, simply king h8. And white looks like he should be giving mate any moment. But as a matter of fact, there's really never any mate available, and it ends up being a draw. And there's also all kinds of messes available to white after gf6, queen f6, knight d5, queen f3, and here there's a move bishop b4, which you can play. There's a move queen d1, which you can play, but black stands quite well after all of those things. What you should do in this position after knight e5, bishop takes e5, is play g6. Black cannot really play bishop e6 in reply because gf7 followed eventually by queen g6 check is extremely strong. What black should do is play rook e7 or king h8 first. It leads to the same position. Gf king h8, white goes knight e2, black takes on e3, goes bishop e6 here. And after some thought, the machine finally ends up saying that white is at least slightly better after queen g6, queen f8, and bishop b4, specifically in this order. Black is supposed to hang on a second. Let me find where I am in the analysis. It's very easy to lose your place here. If black plays the natural move bishop d6, white takes first on d6, then on e6, and then stunningly just goes knight f4, rook takes e3, and king d1. And here I actually gave up. I tried understanding why this is hugely better for white, and the machine continues insisting this is close to winning for white. But at some point I just said to myself, yeah, no, I don't understand it, and I just need to accept it as a fact of life here. But white is very, very significantly better here. And I think part of the reason is if you play rook e7, there's a very, very strong move queen g2, creating this super fork threat on g6, and you cannot take with the queen because queen takes a8 wins. So after bishop b4, you're actually supposed to take on a2, bishop takes e7, you take on f7, and you play this endgame, which is slightly better for white, but black definitely retains drawing chances after, let's say, castles, and you can choose between bishop h5 or knight e4 or rook e8. I think bishop h5 is probably the strongest one, but all of these moves have their reasons. So this is what would have happened had Radjabov played rook g1, or at least could have happened, because obviously finding all these moves would not have been easy for both of these players. But rook g1 keeps advantage, I think, for white. After gh6, which is what Teimour played, black needs to find a sequence of only moves, but I think he is still alive here. And the move you need to make here, and it's strictly the only move here, and we completely missed it during the live show, for instance, which I think should be at least some indication that it's not immediately obvious, is the move bishop f4. Basically trying to take the pawn on h6 away as early as possible and not allow queen g6 with mate. Queen g6 will be met here simply by bishop takes h6, and doesn't care that the pawn on f6 is lost with check, because his counterplay in the center is just stronger. After bishop f4, white can take on g7. D takes c3 is sort of playable, but I think white is generally does most of the running. And I probably would not have shown you this move at all, because I don't think black should make it, but there is an absolutely stunning line there as well. dc3, bishop takes c3. The machine, after some thought, insists that the only move to make here is b5, b4. Already not very easy to understand why that would be, but I think it's important to have some option of taking on b4 with the knight later in the game. ab, now you play bishop e6, rook d1, queen e7. White takes on f6. If you recapture on f6, there is queen takes c6, and white is much better. But you do have this move knight takes b4, so this sort of explains why you played b4 earlier. And here, and this is just unbelievably beautiful, white goes queen h7 check, king takes h7, and g8 queen check. The point of this is that if black takes with the rook, white goes bishop b1 check, and then just picks up the queen on e7, and this will be hanging, this will be hanging, everything will be hanging, black resigns. But you can take with the king on g8, white goes rook g1 check, and now both king h7 and king f8 in particular lead to what appears to be a draw. So yeah, yet another variation which is fun to play through, but very, very difficult to understand if you're not a machine. But after hg7, black could also play for more crazy positions by just playing bishop e6. Once again, killing off the main enemy, the bishop on a2. And this leads to positions which could even potentially be better for black. Because let's say after long castles we can take on a2, and if white just recaptures on a2, you can play queen d5, attacking both knights, and the machine already suggests black is much better. So it's a huge mess, but it's a mess that black probably will even enjoy more than white. Therefore, after bishop f4, white should castle long to avoid all this stuff. Bishop takes h6 and e takes d4. If you allow bishop takes h6, he will resign, so you take on d2, queen takes. And quite obviously, black needs to start something on the queen side, or once again, his position will collapse on the king side. If you allow white to play rook hg1 here, unimpeded, you will lose. So you play b4. And here there are some weird positions available to white after rook g1. Let's say b takes c3, queen g5, and black plays bishop g4. Here I actually gave up and decided not to investigate very much further because the machine said that this is playable for black. Exactly how much playable I thought was not that interesting. Or you can take on b4, knight takes b4 and bishop c4. Once again, if you give white time to play something like rook g1, you will be in a tremendous amount of trouble. So you play bishop c6, white goes knight e5, black takes on d2, king takes d2, takes on h1, rook h1, knight d7, and as often is the case, after all the craziness and sacrifices and pieces left unprised for 5 moves in a row, we end up in some endgame, which is incredibly likely to end in a draw. So had Vidit played bishop f4 in this position, I think he would have had very, very decent chances to not lose the game at all. But instead he couldn't really restrain himself any longer and picked up this sacrifice on c3. And from this moment on, it's basically plain sailing for white. Bishop takes c3 is the reply, and now none of this works anymore. Queen g6 is a winning threat. If you play bishop f4 here, white goes queen g6, bishop takes h6, and here the same idea as previously, but with a slight twist. You go rook d1. Because castle here, black will go queen e7, and after bishop takes c6, there is a very important additional idea of queen c5 check, and black actually is slightly better even, because you cannot play king b1, bishop f5 check wins your queen. You have to go back to c3, and now black goes bishop e6, and starts driving all of white's attacking pieces back, and the machine even prefers black here. But if you play rook d1, none of this will happen. After queen e7, you can take on f6, and black will actually finally be obliged to go for the same endgame as previously, which is horrible, frankly. You don't have to resign yet, but you are not expected to hold this if you play this position with black. Play bishop e6 here. And here, once again, the computer says that rook g1 immediately is even stronger than what Radjabov did. But Radjabov's move, which was bishop takes e6, does not really let the advantage slip. It does give black slightly more defensive options, though. After rook g1, black has to take on a2, white takes on g7, king f8, rook takes a2. And the thing is, there's really no adequate response to a huge threat of knight g5. The best black has here is to play bishop e5, knight g5, queen d5. And here the machine says you can just collect the queen, include a4 before, just to create more weaknesses for black. Takes. And here it says you can just play, let's say, rook a2, a1, returning the rook to into the game. And it turns out that it's almost impossible for black to coordinate properly, because the knights don't really have pawns to support them. The king is perennially weak on f7. White just plays king e2. I think the next two moves white wants to make most of all is king e2 followed by rook g1. And yeah, this is just a very, very bad position. Black is once again not expected to survive this. After bishop takes e6, which is what Radjabov played in the game, black took, rook g1. And this is the one final important turning point in the game, where Vidit could have put up a lot more resistance had he found this really weird geometrical idea of playing not knight e8, which is what he played in the game, but knight h5, white takes on g7 with the bishop, and here you can play bishop g3. This is the big difference, that you support the g3 square with your knight, and this way black manages to actually close down the g file, and also for the time being to prevent white from castling queenside. And white is better in a number of ways here, but the one I like the most, and because of just how outlandish it looks, black is currently threatening to take on e3 with check because of the pin of the f2 pawn, and the computer very quietly just goes king e1, e2 in this position, not really threatening anything, just stopping rook takes e3, queen e7, and here the best line appears to be something like bishop c3, recreating the threat of h7, h8, black takes, you go queen f5. Once again, I'm not sure if there is an immediate direct threat, but after rook e8, rook ad1, if you give the machine some time, it starts saying that white is much better. But it was still better to play knight h5 in this position than knight e8, because knight e8 turns out to just lose by force. Bishop takes g7, knight g7 is the only move, rook g7, king f8 is the only move, queen h7, queen f6 is basically the only move, because otherwise you lose the queen. And now knight g5. You have to take on e3, because some knight takes e6 is completely hopeless. e3. And here, the one final important decision, but really not a very difficult one. Black has immediate perpetual after fe3, bishop g3, but after king f1, the checks just completely run out. If black plays knight e5 here, you can the rook on a8, and after bishop c5, the machine likes the most the maneuver queen g2, queen takes h6, and rook g8. It looks a bit passive, but it really isn't, because the rook on e3 is hanging. It's impossible to attack the rook on g8. White also completely secures the position of his king and basically wins by force here. Although, if you want to win it as quickly as the computer will win it, you probably will struggle, but the computer wins it more or less instantaneously here. The rook is hanging, the really is queen f6, and here you can play queen d5. Rook e1 check does absolutely nothing, because the king very easily runs out from all the checks. And if you make a move like bishop d6, now the machine goes queen a8 and says there's absolutely no defense against queen d8 or queen e8 mate, so please resign. Instead of all this, after king f1, Vidit played knight d8, but sadly for him, queen g8 check, king e7 and h7 is just overwhelmingly strong. This pawn is about to become a queen. Really, the only way to continue here is bishop g3 if you want to continue for long. He could have played, for a very beautiful trap, he could have played queen f4 here, and white puts a queen up, black plays queen c4 check, you go king g1, g3 check, and here, if you take with the pawn, black has a very beautiful perpetual along the c file of all things, because it's very important for black to have the check from c2 if white goes king g2. Nothing else works at all, but if you play queen c2 check here, you actually do have the perpetual along, as I mentioned, the c file. But after rook g3 check, white can just very calmly play king h1, queen c6, or queen d5, f3, and the checks run out, and at some point white will start giving checks of his own, and he has this really nice structure with the queens on g8 and h8, which basically means that the very first check white gives in this game will be the final check that black sees. So yeah, my screen currently is saying mate in 11. In view of all that, black plays bishop g3 here, at least creating one mate in one idea, but there is a very strong reply in knight e4. Rook has to take, white takes, and the h7 pawn is just much stronger than everything else. The only move to make, not to resign on the spot, is rook h4, and here more or less everything wins, but I really like Teimour's decision not to even start chasing the king, but to illustrate to Vidit just how helpless this king is in the center. Rook d1, creating a threat of, very simply, rook e3 check and then queen takes a8. Vidit made the only move not to resign on the spot, rook takes h7, rook e3, knight e6, queen takes a8. Queen d8 mate is still very much a threat because of the pin. Yeah, I can't draw arrows at all today. Black plays rook h8, queen c6, king f8. I mean, king f8 loses on the spot, but really there's no good advice to be given for black here at all. And here rook f3 is completely winning, but rook takes e6, the move that Teimour chose, is, I think, aesthetically more pleasing. If you take with the pawn, rook d7 is immediate mate, queen takes c7 is also more or less immediate mate. So black takes with the queen, and now white goes rook d8 check. The rook is hanging, so the king has to go here, check. The only way to protect the rook is to play f6, and now queen takes c7 check, and white will eventually win that rook on h8. And here Vidit finally resigned, because the position really is very lost. So I hope you enjoyed my trying to explain what happened in the game. I honestly am still somewhat at a loss about the extremely complicated and frankly crazy positions that could have arisen somewhere in the sequence between e5, g5, and black taking on c3 in the game. That is basically when play became a lot more explicable for a human eye. But regardless of all that, a very impressive victory by Teimour Radjabov, who quite clearly came to the game to play the whole h3 g4 idea. I think is probably dubious and will not be repeated very often at a high level, but it's a very spectacular, very explosive idea, and Teimour was able to show the full extent of the dangers that black faces if he is not very precise in reply. So, as I said, very beautiful, very nicely played game, and with that victory, Vidit goes back to 50%, having lost this game, and Teimour is half a point behind no less than 5 people tied for first on 4.5 out of 7. The previous leaders, Nepomniachtchi, drew against Ding, so they both scored half a point. Carlsen drew with black against Fedoseev, having been basically worse for much of the game. And they were joined by Vishnyanand, who has won a very nice game against Vladimir Kramnik, and Anish Giri, obviously, who was on +2 prior to this round. So 5 people in the lead on 4.5 out of 7, and Teimour Radjabov, one of the people chasing them, on 4 points. Once again, thanks for watching this video, and I hope you join the live broadcast, which once again tomorrow starts at 1:30 Central European Time. This has been Peter Svidler for Chess24, and bye-bye.